Let us now introduce contestant number 4, Ms. YEUNG. Please come onto the stage.
The title of her speech is Tackling the Tension Between Those from Hong Kong and from Mainland China. You now have 3 minutes. You may begin after the bell rings.
Locust, uncivilized, rude. What is the first thing that springs to your mind when you hear these words? The mainland Chinese? With their increasing purchasing power, they cause tension in Hong Kong. It is very easy for me to stand here today and offer you schemes to stop them from coming to Hong Kong. However, let's consider this from a different angle, and you may realize that it is not as straightforward as we think. Conflict between Hong Kong and China should not be tackled. And I will examine why in terms of 2 major conflicts: the competition for obstetric services and parallel traders. Mainland mothers come to Hong Kong and with wealth overload the quota for mothers giving birth in private hospitals. Nearly half of the babies are born to mainland mothers, which are considered a burden to our society. However, what many of us fail to see is that with the fertility rate of only 1.1, we face a declining population. 440 schools and numerous facilities have already been closed through underutilization. Therefore, we need the mainlanders to give birth in Hong Kong to maintain our standard of living and to support our aging population. Additionally, anti-China sentiment stems from parallel traders. Before we consider them a nuisance, we must first consider why they buy commodities in bulk to sell in China. After the melamine milk incident in 2008, consumer confidence in Chinese products was shaken, so the mainland Chinese opt for foreign imports instead, which are restricted by trade barriers in China. This problem can be solved by prompting the Chinese government to remove the trade barriers, which will in turn solve the shortages in Hong Kong. However, what we must bear in mind is that Hong Kong will risk losing its appeal as a shopping paradise. The livelihood of more than 200,000 Hong Kong people depends on the $110 million mainland tourists spend in Hong Kong. Can we really risk losing all that in exchange for a few more cans of milk powders on a shelf or less time lining up for cosmetics? To conclude, how can we tackle the tension between Hong Kong and China? Eliminating the conflict of interest is not the solution. What Hong Kong needs is to simply increase our tolerance towards the mainland Chinese, a point supported by a top Beijing representative, Zhang Xiaoming, in yesterday's news. We have to see the bigger picture and not dwell on the immediate effect they have on us. How do we increase people's tolerance? Education. The word locust should be used to describe real grasshoppers, not the compatriots of our own country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Ms. Farino will now ask you a question relating to your speech. The bell will ring right after the question has been asked, and you'll have 1 minute to respond to the question. Ms. Farino, please.
Thank you. You make very logical arguments on why it is beneficial for Hong Kong to welcome mainlanders on several levels, on the economic level for one. But this is largely, I feel, a lot of the issue is an emotional issue for Hong Kong people. How would you convince your fellow Hong Kong citizens of this benefit that you speak of?
Thank you for your question. I believe that I can convince my fellow citizens by education. A Nobel Peace Prize winner, Lester B. Pearson, once said, "How can there be peace without people understanding each other?" The emotional issues that prevail in Hong Kong is because of a lack of understanding towards the mainland Chinese. When we see one thing that happens to one mainland Chinese, we hastily generalize and assume that all of the mainstream people are uncivilized or rude. However, that is not the case. Therefore, I believe that we should educate the Hong Kong people to tolerate them and to understand the reason for our cultural differences. For example, Hong Kong had been a British colony, whereas under the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese were practically indoctrinated to reject Western influences. And whilst we're much exposed to Western ideas much earlier, it would be unfair for us to judge them on such standards. And therefore, I believe that we should really promote understanding through education and thus convince them to tolerate and understand them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A second question will now be asked by Ms. Trotter. Again, the bell will ring right after the question, and you may then respond to the question. Ms. Trotter, please.
Thank you, Choi-Yan. Often in the media, we read about workers in factories in the developing world labouring under very difficult and dangerous conditions, not receiving an adequate wage, and not being allowed due rest. What is the social responsibility of companies that operate factories, and how can there be safeguards against the exploitation of labour?
In order to safeguard the workers from exploitation, I believe that the government should play a huge part by its legislation. For example, they should set a minimum wage or the maximum working hours in order to ensure that they're not being exploited. However, what we must bear in mind is that the legislation cannot go to such an extent that it will deter the companies from using cheap labor. For example, a major reason why people export their labor in Brazil or Bangladesh, such poor country, is because of the cheap labor. If we were to raise the price, then they may stop using such labor, and this will create a larger problem when unemployment rises. For example, in Bangladesh, the average wage people get is $1 per day, $1 per day. However, some multinationals are offering $2 per day, which we consider as low, however, is already high for them. And therefore, we must be very careful to strike a balance between legislation and...
Thank you. Please take a seat.
Thank you.